Hey everyone, in this video, we're going to go over the request library and how to use it with Python. So request is a good library for making API requests, and we're going to go over kind of the basics and different parts of it so you can make different types of requests with Python. The first thing we can do is we can open up a terminal and we can type pip install requests to install the library. Once that's done, we'll come back in the code and we'll get started. So the first thing we do when we want to use the library is we want to import it. We'll do import requests at the top of our file to import this library. And now let's go over making a basic GET call with requests. So if you're not familiar with API calls, there's different types of methods you can use: get, post, patch, delete, options, a few other ones. But in this case, we're going to get some data and return it and print it out to the screen. So we're going to use a GET call for that. And I have opened up here this JSON placeholder page. What this is like a fake API, and it allows us to make these API calls. So we can make an API call, run it, and it prints out. It gives us like a fake response back. So it allows us to make API calls and get responses back without having to actually set up an API. So it's good for testing or whenever you need fake data. If we come down here to the bottom, you'll see the C guide for usage examples, and this will tell us how to use this API, fake API here. So I'm going to look for a GET request. Listing resources, getting resources right here. Okay, so getting listing resources, I'm going to use one of these. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL. I'm going to change this from posts to to-dos, and we'll use their to-dos. Okay, so now that I have the URL copied, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and set up a request GET call. So we'll do requests.get and pass in a string and pass in the URL. Now let's go ahead and just try printing this out and seeing what we get. So first I'll set this to a variable, do like get response equals request.get, and we'll print out get response. And I'll come back to my terminal here and I will run Python 3 in my tutorial.py page here. And you'll see we get back this response 200. Now there isn't much really showing here. You don't really know what's in this response. It doesn't really give us much information. All we know is we got a 200 response back. So there's a few different ways we can look at this. First, let's go ahead and do help and then get response. And this will give us more information on this response object. So when request makes a call and returns a response, it puts it into like a response class, like a response object, and that has different methods and properties on it we can use. So now if we run this with the help function added on, you can see all the properties we have on our response class here. We have these different magic methods. We'll skip those. We scroll down here. We have a JSON function. And so if we make an API call that returns JSON, we can use this JSON function to kind of load it into Python for us. So if you use the Python JSON library, it's the same as taking the JSON string and putting it through json.loads to return it into a Python dictionary. That's a very useful function. We'll use a bunch in this tutorial. If we scroll down here, content, response in bytes. If you have like an image, you may want to use content to get that image. Scrolling down, OK will return true if it's a successful response and false if it's not. Text is just the kind of plain text response. That also may be useful at times. But that's really it. Those are the kind of methods we're going to use in this tutorial. So that kind of gives you kind of overview on the response class. Now let's go ahead and get into actually using it. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out this line right here. And I want to first, let's just print out the status code. So we can print out that with get response.status code. And then run this again, and you'll see we get back 200. So 200 is a successful response, so that's good. But now we made this GET call for these posts. I'm going to go and just change it to to-dos just for this tutorial. But we made this GET call for these to-dos. So it should send us back a list of to-dos. But right now we're not getting that. Well, that's because it's in the JSON body of that response. So what we can do is we can print out the JSON response. We get response.json function. And this will give us our actual response back in JSON. Now there's this huge list here. We can go through, we can parse this list of all these different to-dos. but you can see we got all of our data back from the API right here. So this is one easy way of getting back our data in API calls. If you make API calls with requests, you'll use this JSON function a lot. And of course, we could print the raw text as well. We could do print get response.text to get that as well if you wanted to print that too. And you'll see here, we get this all back right and here. All of our different to-dos. Okay, and that's kind of a really basic get response. That's how you set up a request. You can just pass in the URL and a string inside either get. This could also be post. This could be patch. This could be delete. Whatever the method is you want to run, they all go right here. But for a get method, it's very simple. We can pass in just the string and return it right there. Now, there's much more options we could add as well, and we'll get into that in a second. But for a very basic response to an API, that's all you need. Let's go on to the next step of this tutorial, and let's look at a post. And this time, we're going to have a request body because we have a post request and some headers as well. And we'll look at how we can pass it all in to our request API call. So first thing we'll do is we'll start it as we did before. We'll do a post response equals requests. And this time, since we want a post request dot post, make a post request. And the first thing we'll do is we'll pass in our URL right here, this to-dos, we'll pass in right there. Now, this alone won't work because we want to make sure we have a JSON request body as well as the headers setting our content type to JSON. And so we need two more things in our request here. First is a body. This is just the JSON body. And next is the headers. So if you make API calls in the past, you'll know sometimes you have these different API headers that go in, and then you have some JSON, maybe data you pass in as well. That's what these two things are. So in the body, I want to add my data for this request. So in this example, if we were to go back to our JSON placeholder here and go down to creating a resource, this is when we use a post method. So this is in JavaScript, which is not what we're going to use here, but the idea is still kind of the same. We want to go ahead and create a resource for our to-do. And so we look at what our to-dos look like. We want to make sure we add a user ID, a title, and completed when we create a new resource. And so we're going to go ahead and mock that in our code right now, creating a new to-do resource. So first thing I'm going to pass in is a user ID. We can set this to 1. Next, we want a title. This will just be like whatever we want, test to do. And then we'll add a completed set to false. So this is us mocking our to-do data with our user ID, our title, and completed. This will get passed into the JSON body. Next, we want some headers. So we want to add one header here, and this is just to set our content type. So content-type, set it to application/JSON. That just tells it that this is JSON. Okay, and that's really it. Now we have those two things set up. But now how do we actually use these? Well, it's very easy. Inside the requests.post, after our URL string, we can add in some more parameters here. You can see them all right here, JSON, params, headers. There's all sorts of different ones we can use. In this case, we want to use the JSON one for our JSON body. So JSON equals body, and then headers set equals to headers. And so that's how we can pass in our request body as well as some headers for our requests. Let's go ahead and print out this result. So we'll print post response, and we'll run this and see what we get. You'll see we got a 201, which stands for created, which means we successfully created a new resource. Let's go ahead and just do a .json on this response as well. And you'll see we got back our data that we created, that we passed in. So we have our user ID set to 1, our test to do, completed the false, and it automatically set an ID for us when we created the resource. So now we've successfully created a resource using the post method. And so if you ever use post calls and APIs, which you probably will, that is how you do it there. Let's continue on and look more at the successful response. So you'll notice in this first call right here, if I were to look at the status code, and then look at the status code for this one up here, this get response, you'll notice that they both were successful, but they have different status codes. One is 200, one is 201. So there could be more than one different type of successful status code depending on what you're doing with your request. And because of that, just checking for 200 may not cover all of the bases. Well, if you remember back when we looked at the help for the response object, it had an OK property on it. And what OK will return is true or false if it's less than 400. So anything in the 100s, 200s, or 300s is considered successful. And we will return a successful response if we have one of those. So we can do a quick test for this and see if we have a successful response with our post response request here. So I'll do if post response dot OK. If it is OK, print success, else print failure. In this case, because we got 201, that will evaluate to true here, and it should print success. Let's go back to our terminal and run this and see what we get. And we get success. So now we're able to successfully check if we have a good response based off this value coming back from our request, coming back in our response from the request that we made. Okay, let's go ahead and comment this out, and I'm going to jump into the next section. And the next section, we want to look at adding URL parameters. So if you notice up in this one up here, we create a request body, but that's not in the URL. If we look at like an example in our JSON placeholder, we scroll down some, you'll notice we may find a question mark with something after it, like right here, we have a question mark, user ID equals 1. So in this case, we have our URL, which is this whole part right here. And then we have our parameters, which is anything with a question mark. And then if there's more, it'll be like and another one and another one. So they have the ampersand sign after the question mark. But anything after the question mark are our parameters. And so we could manually hard code this in our URL, but we could also pass it into our function like we did for the body. Let's go ahead and look at a quick example for that. So we're going to follow this same sort of example here, filtering resources. And we're going to filter our to-dos based on the user ID. So we'll first set up our request like we did in all the previous ones. So do filter response equals requests dot get. I'll pass in a URL. In this case, I'll just grab my one from here, this to-dos. But we want to add a question mark user ID equaling to user ID to actually filter it. But instead of hard coding this, let's set a parameter up above. So we'll do params equals a dictionary, and we'll pass in our parameter we want. In this case, user ID set to the value we want. In this case, 1. And then inside of a request here, we can add params equals params, which is that variable we created right over here. Now let's go ahead and print this filter response, see what we get, see if we get a successful response. We get a 200 response, that's good. Now let's go ahead and just do a .json on this response here and do it again. And you'll see all these to-dos being returned all have a user ID of 1. So we've correctly filtered out the to-dos based off of this. And this sort of params thing is helpful and useful just for dynamically setting params. Instead of having to hard code things into a URL, we can create a dictionary, put them all inside a dictionary, and then pass that into our request. It's a little cleaner, a little easier to read, in my opinion, which is a nice feature to have. Okay, now we've talked about kind of all the different pieces of making requests. Of course, we could make a patch call too, make a delete call like we said before, but those are pretty self-explanatory and they follow the same sort of concepts we already did. So let's go ahead and look at some other things. The first thing I want to look at is authorization. And to do this authorization test, I'm going to use a different website. So we have this JSON placeholder we're using, but let's jump over to this HTTP bin. Now this is another HTTP request response service, but they have some authorization stuff for us, which helps for testing authorization. So now for a quick overview on authorization, there's different types. You can see the different types here. We're going to focus on these top two, which seem to be the most used, at least the most I've seen used. The first being this basic auth, where we will create a basic auth object from a user name and password. The other one is a bearer token, and we'll put that into the header, and we will go over that one in a second. So first, with this basic auth, you can see here the route to it right here is a username and password, and then normally you wouldn't put this in the URL. This is just here for testing. We can validate that the one we pass into our authorization matches in our URL, but in practice you wouldn't actually put it in the URL, but it works for our testing here. So let's go ahead and set this up. So first I'm going to do is set a response object, or set up a response like we did before. So basic auth response equals requests dot get. This is a get request, I believe. If we look at it, yep, it is a get request. So request dot get, and the URL is HTTPS, and it's http bin.org/basic-auth basic-auth, and then we have username. Let's do test user and a password of password. Okay, and now we want to create an authorization, a basic authorization, and pass that in. So above this, I'll create a variable called auth. This will be equal to a tuple, which will have two values. First, the username, so I'll pass in test user. Second being the password, which is in this case is just password. Now to pass in this auth object into our response, it's pretty simple. Once again, we just add it here, and there's one called auth, so we can call it auth equals auth and save that, and then run this. And I didn't print it out. Let's make sure we print this out so we can see the response. Print basic auth response. And you'll see we get a 200. Now, just for testing, let's change the password to something different, like password 1. We should see a 400 or a 401, I think, come back. 401, yep. So we can test that we're both successful and failure messages that way. But that's how you set up a basic auth in requests. Let's go on to the next type of authorization you'll see common, which is a bearer token. And this is pretty simple. We already talked about headers, so it's really not going to be too different from what we've done before. But we'll set up our response like this: requests.get, passing in the same URL minus the basic auth stuff. And then this URL to test the bearer token goes to /bearer. Now, if we go ahead and just run just this alone, we'll see what we get. I forgot to print out again. Let's make sure we print that out. We run this, you'll see we'll get that 401 again. So how do we make this response successful? Well, a bearer token just gets passed into the headers. So what we'll do is we'll set a headers variable once again. This will be equal to a dictionary. And then inside this headers dictionary, first we want a key of authorization. And then we'll have a value of bearer space and a bearer token, which is just going to be whatever our bearer token is. We can put whatever now as our example. And now, once again, we just pass in the headers like we did before, just headers equals headers. And then when we come back and run this again, our 401 turns into a 200 response because we successfully passed in a bearer token. And this sort of setup, this authorization and then bearer space, that's just how you set up bearer tokens. It just comes from how that works. So don't worry too much about this, but bearer tokens get passed in the headers the same way as before. Basic auth gets passed in with this little auth keyword here instead. That's the big takeaway there, so you can understand the difference of different types of authorization and how to use them. Okay, on to the next step. We want to talk about some common status codes. So in case you're not familiar with HTTP status codes, I wanted to go over them real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste this code in here so you can see what it is that we're doing. So there's all these different status codes. Some of them I could mock using different things. Some I had just to go ahead and grab the status code from the HTTP bin website. But you can see the different types of status codes we have here. 200 is just an okay status code. Things went okay. 201 is just created. You'll see that one too. Anything less than 400 is considered successful. 400 is a bad request. So for example, if we were to go to our JSON placeholder, pass in some bad data into one of our request bodies, for example, this creating a resource, if something in our body was set incorrectly, it may throw a 400. 401 being unauthorized, usually it means we're missing our authorization that we need. 403 means forbidden. Typically that means we are authorized, but we're forbidden for accessing whatever page we're trying to access. 404, not found. If the route is wrong, if I just, like, for example, went to my JSON placeholder, and instead of doing to-dos, I got rid of the S, it will then throw a 404 because this URL doesn't exist. And 500 is a server error. That is something on the API end where things are not working correctly. Anything in the 400s is considered client errors. Something with how you're setting your request up is wrong. And the 500 is on the server side. So if I go ahead and just save this and just print out these different status codes, you can see what they all look like. They all look like they do before: 200, 400, 44, 43, 500. They all just kind of show up like this. And of course, we can go grab the text and error messages too, if those existed, to get more information on why things failed. Okay, and now the last step of this tutorial, I want to talk about timeouts and try and accept and more gracefully handling errors. So one thing with requests is that there's no actual timeout. If it is waiting for response, it will just wait indefinitely. So we couldn't set a timeout as well on our requests. And if we look at our website here, this HTTP bin one, and down here, we do have this delay thing to test things being delayed. Let's go ahead and try that out now and see what happens when we delay a request. So I'll do timeout response equals requests.get https://httpbin.org/delay. And let's go ahead and just delay it for 5 seconds. We'll print out timeout response. And I'm also going to go ahead and just comment out all these errors and ever status codes just so we don't make this all very messy. Comment all that out, and we will run this real quick. And you'll notice here, it just sits here and just waits, and nothing happens. Nothing will happen for 5 seconds until it prints the response. Now, at some point, if this was super long, that could be an issue. So instead, we can go ahead and set a timeout for it with the timeout key. So we just do timeout equals and then anything we want. So we can do 2 seconds, for example, and pass in just timeout equals 2. And now it will wait 2 seconds. If it takes longer than that, it will throw an error or throw an exception. So if I go ahead and run this again, we'll wait 2 seconds and then you'll see this exception show up. And there it is. Now this isn't really a great way just for it to throw an exception and break the code. That's not really a great way to handle having timeouts. So instead, we can more gracefully handle exceptions using the try except in Python. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this up real quick, and then I'll explain it. We have try, and then except. So try except, what it does is it will say, go ahead and try doing all this code. If there's an exception, jump down to this code. So it will stop at whatever line throws the exception. So in this case, if timeout response throws an exception, it will never print anything here. It will go from here straight down to line 101 and print this timed out. Now this is fine like this, but it would be better to handle more specific exceptions. And so luckily we can do that with our code here, and request has these exceptions built in. So if I put a space next to except, I do requests.exceptions.timeout with a capital T. I can do that as E. I can then print timed out. If I wanted to, I could put like, the error message too, or the exception too. And then this will allow us to handle the exception better. I print this now. Notice we'll get this timed out, and then we get this HTTP connection pool timed out, and it gives us our timeout limit here of 2 seconds. So that's just a better way of handling exceptions. There's other exceptions you can handle too, but putting it into a try except just makes it a little cleaner and allows you to continue your code. You could do like a retry in this except block if you wanted to, and keep doing something else instead of it just failing and breaking. But that is really it. We've covered all the basics of requests. We've talked about request bodies, headers, authorization, different status codes, timeouts. There's more we could do. Obviously, there's a lot more in that library, but this covers all the basics. So hopefully that gets you started with making API calls using requests. If you have any questions, let me know. But that is it for this video. All the code will be in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.